it's John. So continuing off where I left off in the previous video regarding the Bentley Flying Spur, I will get to the median that I mentioned shortly. I'll get to a few screenshots of that, but I want to talk more about the Bentley Flying Spur. Think about this. What are the odds that a car with the word flying in it, right? The Bentley Flying Spur, right? What are the odds that a car named like that with the word flying in it would crash by flying through the air just by pure chance, pure bad luck? What are the odds of that? Pretty slim, I think you'd admit, right? Since most cars do not have the word flying in it. So what are the odds that any car with the word flying in it would crash in such a way that it flew through the air right before it, before impact and explosion, right? What are the odds of that happening, just by itself through pure chance? I think, extremely slim. But I think the odds are much better if somebody hacked the car and they knew exactly what type of car they were hacking and they knew exactly what they planned to do with it because they'd done their research. In other words, they knew where the median was. They knew the stretch of road leading to the median. They knew how quickly that car could accelerate to 100 miles an hour, which is about 165 kilometers an hour. Okay, they knew all that information. They can learn that information very easily if they're a hacker. Even if they're not a hacker, that's publicly available information. But if they are a hacker, they can learn that information very easily. They could also get the, as far as the median goes, they could get that from satellite shots. Even if they could hack a satellite, that's also evidence of that. I've shown on previous videos that satellites can be hacked. So there are satellites with powerful cameras that can take the picture of a license plate from outer space. Those have been around for decades. Those are just the ones that they publicly tell us about, right? So, if this hacker, who of course I suspect strongly is my brother, if he decided to scope out an area to see, where a perfect place was, in other words, where there was a median, right, with a stretch of road there, and also if he wanted to incorporate the border, the U.S.-Canada border, in his narrative of that particular crash that he was planning before it happened, because I think he plans these very carefully. He could have gotten those shots, of various roads and thoroughfares and medians. He could have got that. He could have got those camera shots from an outer space camera, even, right? Like I said, from a satellite camera, right? By hacking it and deciding on the perfect location. He could have been there in person too, right? But then, as far as the people who were driving the car, he could have hacked a car dealership in the Niagara Falls area if he decided to do the crash in Niagara Falls, and I believe he did. And I'll get to that later, either in this video or the next one. Why I think he specifically chose Niagara Falls. Okay, I'll get to that shortly, either in this video or the next one. So again, I think he had the location planned before the other details. Or he may have already had the other details that he was thinking of using in another crash elsewhere, but then he decided to do it in Niagara Falls. And I think the reason he did it in Niagara Falls, I'll just briefly say now, and I'll show you my supporting evidence after either this video or the next one. I think the reason he decided Niagara Falls was because just 2 days before this crash, I watched a particular movie where Niagara Falls featured prominently in it. Not only that, but it featured people going from the U.S. Into Niagara Falls and actually headed for Toronto, just like these people were headed from Niagara Falls into Canada and headed for Toronto. Excuse me, right? So, and there's a few other coincidences about that movie, and I have screenshots of that I'm going to get to either later in this video, probably the next one. I'll probably run out of time on this one, but anyway, so I'll get that shortly. But back to the Bentley and the other research, right? So basically, yeah. So let's say he does the research on, So let's say he's already in his mind decided he's going to do it in Niagara Falls, right? Then he can pick a dealership in Niagara Falls, like Niagara Falls, New York, anywhere in the upper New York State area. He can pick a dealership that sells Bentley Flying Spurs. Or any Bentleys, obviously. I'm sure they sell more than just that model, right? So he could pick a dealership, and then he can hack their computer database. And believe me, with all the evidence I've presented so far, it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that he could hack a corporate databases, a corporate computer. Corporate computers are hacked all the time. You only hear the tip of the iceberg on the news when you hear a story every once in a while on the news about some company being hacked and asked for ransomware. Or there's ransomware put on their computer, and then the hackers ask them, to pay the ransom. Right? You've heard that story before, right? It's just the tip of the iceberg what you hear on the news. Right? For everyone you hear on the news, there's probably another 100 or even 1,000 that you don't hear about, because most corporations will not even admit that. Okay, I've done research on this. I may have mentioned some previous video about how corporations are will often be dishonest about will say anything to save profits. I've either mentioned on some previous video. I'm going to mention it in some future video, including I'm going to show screenshots. If I haven't already, I will in some future videos show screenshots of corporations caught committing crimes, including Walmart recently, or I don't know, whatever you want to define as recently, sometime in the last couple of years. I have screenshots of that. They were fined like $200 million or something for committing some fraud, okay? This is Walmart, the biggest corporation in the world, okay? So, if they commit crime to save money, outright to save money, of course, they're going to do something that's not illegal, but it is immoral, which is not to admit they were hacked, right? Because, by them not admitting they're hacked, I mean any corporation, by not admitting it, it just, makes the problem worse, because the public doesn't doesn't realize how serious it is, and then the politicians aren't given pressure to do something about it, et cetera, right? So the point is, corporations can be hacked all the time, right? And I think, and as far as my brother, I think he was hacking corporations back at least as far as 2007, or even before that. Like when we reconnected in 2007 after not having any contact for a number of years, over a decade actually. But the thing is, he called me a few years before that. I don't know, maybe around 2004, somewhere around there, and he called me on my unlisted phone number, right? And I had no idea how he got the phone number then. And when we got together, like in 2007, I asked him about that, and then shortly before that, he told me he was working in IT, which I'd never known before, right? Because when I knew him, he was working in a totally different industry. So anyway, when he told me that, like in 2007, that he was working in IT, I'd never put two and two together until a few days later when I actually asked him, how he got my phone number, considering we had no mutual contacts anymore. And we hadn't spoken to each other, so he couldn't have gotten my phone number from anyone that, we both knew, because we didn't have any more mutual contacts at the time, right? We'd been estranged for like 14 years, right? So then I said, how'd you get my phone number, right? And he said, well, when the person works in IT, there are ways. And then he just let his voice trail off, right? So then quickly I put two and two together and thought, okay, obviously he hacked either a government database, like maybe, the revenue database in Canada, or Canada, it used to be called Revenue Canada, now it's called CRA, Canada Revenue Services. It's basically like the IRS in the States, they just change their name to make themselves look more important, but, we all know what they are, right? Anyway, so you could have hacked them because they would have had my phone number anytime, you do your taxes, you put your phone number on the tax return, and then he could have hacked the phone company, because there's not that many phone companies in Canada, especially at the time, maybe only half a dozen, 10 at the most, right? So he could have hacked them to get my, he could put my name into the various databases of the phone companies, and then, my number would come up, right? Associated with my name, right? So he could have done it that way. The point is, however he did it, he obviously did it by hacking. There's no other way he could have done it. And again, he admitted it indirectly by saying what he just said. What I told you he said, right, is that, he said, well, when someone works in IT, there are ways. I don't know I can't remember if he exactly used the word someone or person or you as in any person, you say, well, when you do this or you do that, and that you could be any person, right? So he said one of those. Or he either said, well, when you work in IT, there are ways. Or, well, when someone works in IT, there are ways. Or, well, when a person works in IT, there are ways, right? So basically, that's a paraphrase, but it's almost exactly what he said. That, when a person works in IT, there are ways, and then he let his voice trail off, and the only ways any reasonable person can think of is by hacking, right? How else do you get an unlisted phone number, right? I mean, when you don't know anyone, mutual contact, and that person's not in the phone book, like not in any database because it's unlisted. How else do you get it? Are you psychic? You pull it out of the universe's, memory, the universal consciousness? Maybe, right? But I think it's more likely that he hacked a corporate database to get my phone number then, and I think he hacked some dealership database now in 2023 to get the names of people who recently bought that car. Okay, so that was such a car, and again, it was a recent car because it was a 2022 model, right? So from last year, so he could have hacked a dealership in Niagara Falls, New York, or anywhere in that general area of upper state New York. He could have hacked it, and then he got a bunch of people's names, until he found other factors, other elements that he thought were appropriate for the type of narrative he was trying to, build for his next crash. In other words, he probably had a list of so-called coincidences he wanted to incorporate in his next crash, which would have been this one. Now it's a past crash, but at the time, obviously, it would have been a future crash. So then, he could have, so look at the elements, if he would have gotten by this point, right? So he would have had Niagara Falls as the location. He would have had the Bentley Flying Spur as the car he wanted to use, right? Obviously, because the word flying, right? Then he would have had, and also because it's a luxury car, so it also relates to a Mercedes-Benz, right? I mentioned that in the previous video, about how that journalist Michael Hastings had been driving a luxury car also in 2013, although his was a Mercedes-Benz and this was a Bentley, right? But still, they're both luxury cars, right? So again, he's got the name of the car plus it's a luxury car, right? The Bentley Flying Spur. He's got Niagara Falls as the location, right? So then he can hack the data, the database of the dealership in the area where he wants to do the crash, right? Then he can find the people because he knows people who buy the car, in that area are going to be more likely to drive in that area, right? So then he can pick, he can get 10, 20, 50, 100 different names, right? And then he can, from those names, he can go hack the motor vehicles office of New York State to get their ages, right? Because on the driver's license, that information is obviously going to be in that particular motor vehicles database. It's going to have their ages of those people, right? So then he gets the names from the dealership, and then he checks the names to get the ages until he finds the ages that he wants, which in this case is 53, right? So he gets two people that are 53, just like I'm 53, right? So that builds his other so-called coincidence involving this, right? And then what else? And then when he finds the people with the right ages, he can basically hack their phones, like their emails, their texts, right? Until he sees what they're planning, right? He can go through 50 of them if he wants, and until he sees who's planning to be driving near the border, in the next couple of days, right, or later that same day, whenever he's doing it, right? Who's planning to be driving there, right? Or he can just be tracking the GPS of all their cars or their phones, which are obviously probably with them in their car, right? He can be tracking that GPS to find out, before he decides which one he's going to hack and crash that day. He can be tracking like 50 of them on some map, on some software data program on whatever computer he's using. He could have some map with the little GPS dot or whatever moving on the map, so then he'll see which one's closest to the border. That's the one he's going to pick to hack, or if he wants to crash it at the border, the closer the better, right? The closer. So I mean, if there's 50 cars driving in the general area that day, he's going to probably pick the one that's closest to the border, right? And again, of those 50 cars, I mean, some of them are probably several of them are going to be that age, because again, he can figure out the ages first too, right? So he can narrow it down, right? He can only focus the GPS tracking on those people who he's already figured out the ages, right? He probably would want at least one to be 53, and then he might get lucky, and there might be two 53, right? It's not that unusual if both will be 53, because they're husband and wife, and often the husband and wife are of a similar age, right? Especially if they met in college or whatever, in the same class, they probably would have been the same age, right? Or working in the same industry, right? I mean, it's not that unusual. And it's also not that unusual it's also not that unusual for lots of people to be driving, around Niagara Falls, even if they don't actually live in Niagara Falls, New York, because again, it is a tourist area. It's near the border, and also there's the casino there, right? So again, he could also have done the research on by looking at previous texts on people, to decide, which GPSs of which particular people to track more. He could have decided that by doing the research on their habits, like by reading texts or emails from the past, when they probably would have been communicating with some friends or colleagues regarding going gambling, right? So you could probably figure out, who's, okay, well, if these guys go gambling, once a week or a couple of times a month, then I want to focus more on, their GPS as I'm tracking it, because they're going to be more likely to be near the border because the casino's near the border, right? So you can put all these things together, all these factors. He can put all of these factors together. And then he can also, see who's been purchasing what, like buying different items online. For example, in this case, tickets. These guys had tickets to go to a KISS concert in Toronto. Okay, so basically, they were probably picked for that reason as well, because as I'm going to show in the next video, because of the coincidences that relate to that movie that I watched just 2 days before this crash happened. Again, there were some people in that movie going from Niagara Falls, New York, into Niagara Falls, Ontario, headed eventually to Toronto. Okay.